Sivir hissed in annoyance as his hatchmate Suv slithered over his tail, turning back to flare his hood at the rude Solarian, and remembered why you weren't supposed to try and flare your hood when you were inside an environmental suit. His scales were bent at odd angles, and he stuck out his two forked tongues in pain as his hatchmate bobbed her head up and down in mirth.
Shut up! You still haven't told us what we're doing on this forsaken planet.
He hissed again, slithering forward slowly as his suit radiated heat into his cold-blooded veins. He was seriously miffed with his hatchmate. She had burst into his home and demanded that he accompany her on a salvage mission, not taking no as an answer. When he had, obviously, protested, she had simply used a heat-absorbing gun to put him to sleep, and he woke up on her ship. Most would consider that kidnapping, but they had both done this to one another since they were small hatchlings. Suv's tail swayed side to side as she continued to move forward, pushing snow away from her body as she began to answer, stopping and struggling to push aside what appeared to be a collapsed pillar in their path. Servos whirred in protest loudly as she grunted. It looked heavy, much heavier than he was used to seeing from salvage missions.
Well, Sivir, I can't do this on my own. We're salvaging a Terran outpost.
Sivir paused behind his hatchmate and let his jaw unhinge and gape slightly. He very nearly strangled his sibling right there as she finally managed to push the pillar to the side, a very dense thwump reverberating through both their environmental suits.
A Terran outpost? Are you insane?
He screeched into his helmet, Suv wincing at the volume. He could see her manually turning her helmet's volume down as he blew out her ear holes. He didn't care. She had made the dumbest decision she had ever made.
Suv, you know better. Terran wreckage is always trapped to the high heaven. Just because they aren't around anymore doesn't mean they're not any less dangerous.
He smacked her upside the back of her environmental suit with his tail, nearly losing his balance as he did. Suv huffed in annoyance as she rubbed the back of her head, turning back to him and trying to flare her own hood, and experiencing the same pain he had when he had attempted to, bowing her head in pain and a little bit of defeat.
Sivir, you know human wreckage is worth 10 Sitins worth of pay. We both have years of experience. We will be fine.
There was a loud groan under their bellies, the ground shaking violently as they both frantically looked for any traps that they might have set off. But they didn't get to look for long as the snow under their suits began to slip downwards, as if draining into somewhere hollow beneath them, the pillar that Suv had just barely moved out of their path slipping beneath the snow.
Shit!
Sivir shouted, grabbed his hatchmate, and tried to slither away from the collapsing floor. But he wasn't fast enough, and they were both sucked beneath the snow, hissing and screaming as they fell, deeper and deeper. With a poof of snow, they both landed in a large snow pile, most likely formed by the snow that had just fallen before they had unfortunately been pulled down with it. Groaning in pain, Suv checked his suit for damage. There were a few scratches, and his heating system had taken a beating, but he was mostly all right. As long as they got out of here soon, he could easily repair the broken heating element. The one that wasn't broken would just have to compensate, for now.
Suv, are you all right?
He whispered, picking himself up off the floor. Well, as much as he could. Half of him would never leave the ground. He heard a more pained groan from the other side of the snow pile and began slithering towards his hatchmate. When he got to where he could see her, he winced slightly. She had landed halfway on the pillar, her suit's electronic pack sparking slightly.
Suv?
He frantically slithered faster before hearing her groan again and let out a dark chuckle. She slowly got onto her belly and ran her hands over her body, wincing as she got about halfway down her tail.
Well, Sivir, I think you were right. This was a very poor decision. I think I broke a couple ribs and fractured my tail.
Suv sighed and wrapped an arm around her waist as he helped her move, slowly looking around where they had fallen. There were wires and tubes everywhere. Many of the tubes were twice their size or larger, many shattered. Almost every single one was dark, nothing inside but bones and ice. The skulls of what Suv assumed were Terrans were terrifying. They were solid, unlike their own. Their jaws were one solid piece of bone, and where their eyes should have been were black and extremely unsettling. It was like they were still watching them, but there was one that wasn't black or shattered. It was coated with frost and snow, a green light blinking slowly at the bottom.
Suv?
He whisper-hissed, nudging her with his arm. She winced in pain before her own eyes found the softly glowing tube and grew wide. She began to slither forward on her own, slipping out from her sibling's arm as he hissed again, trying to stop her. But she wiggled out of his hands, only barely feeling his grip as she placed a gloved hand on the tube.
Think we can sell this to the Galactic Coalition?
She asked him suddenly, turning her head and giving him a greedy grin. Sivir shook his head violently, chest heaving as his eyes darted around the room. Something was very wrong here. Very, very wrong. He didn't like the feel of this place.
Hatchmate, we shouldn't be here. Something feels off.
He whispered as Suv ran her gloved claws over the surface of the object, slowly brushing away the ice and snow. Then trying to jump back with a sharp hiss of pain, her tail slapping the bottom of the tube where the green light blinked. It changed from green to red as the psh of releasing gas filled the air. An automated voice groaned alive, spooking both Suv and Siv.
Initiating revitalization processes. Error, 1 subject found. Proceeding, 10%, 25%, 50%. Restarting heart, failure. Restarting heart, failure. Restart, success. Revitalization at 80%. Restarting brain function, success. Welcome back, Eve.
Suv and Sivir shook in fear as they listened, watching as robotic arms tended to the dark shadow within the tube, hidden by the frost and cloud of gases flowing from within. Suv and Sivir retreated away from the tube, pieces of ice falling away and into the snow as soft poofs. The shadow moved, letting out a deep groan as a hand shot out of the cloud of gas and gripped the edge of the tube. Then another hand leaned out of the darkness, and the shape took a deep breath in and pushed forward, her form clearing as she emerged. It was a Terran, a real, living, breathing Terran. Sivir didn't know what to do. He had never been told what to do in this situation. He had never heard of humans being frozen and coming back from the dead. It wasn't possible. It shouldn't be. There was a soft thrum as something hard was pressed against his forehead, Sivir freezing in place. So you two going to just stand there, or are you going to tell me what the fuck is going on and why all my friends are dead? The Terran growled, her blue eyes locked onto his. There was a snarl on her face, and she looked absolutely furious. He supposed that made sense. She had just woken up from the dead. Maybe she was a psalm, an undead that came back for revenge, unstoppable and consumed by rage. If she was, they were both dead anyway.
We don't know about this place specifically.
The Terran growled and pressed whatever was against his environmental suit's headpiece harder, a scraping sound filling Sivir's ears as his slit-like pupils dilated. His breathing quickened as the Terran grew more furious. Suv quickly cut in and added something of her own, desperate to save her hatchmate.
We're just salvagers.
The Terran closed her eyes and took a deep breath in before pulling what Sivir could now see was some sort of weapon, from his head and holstered it at her hip, pinching the bridge of her nose. I can't understand a word of what you two were saying. Well, I assumed that was words. It was just hissing to me. She walked away, her footsteps shaking the ground under them as she started rummaging through the snow, pulling out boxes from the ice that they hadn't seen when they fell, seemingly ignoring them as she put on a thick jacket and some thick material over her fingers. It was almost like an environmental suit of her own, but it didn't have a helmet, or the helmet didn't have a front plate to seal in the atmosphere. He could probably poke her face if he wanted. Well, if he was 6 lengths taller.
How is she breathing?
Suv whispered to him, leaning over and hissing low. He leaned over to her and softly began to slither back as he kept his eyes on the Terran, tail swaying in the snow.
I don't have a single clue. Honestly, I think she might be a Somm.
They both nodded as the Terran strapped something to her arm, a long object that glowed toward the thicker end, most likely a rifle of some kind, and turned back to them. I can hear you, you know. I can't understand you, though, so you better not be plotting to kill me. The Terran pointed the rifle at the two of them, orange light pulsing back to front as she leveled it. They both shook in fear as she waved the rifle. Come on, you gotta understand this. She poked Siver's back, and he started slithering forward, Sue following right behind him as the human pushed him towards a set of stairs leading back up to the surface. Siver felt the rifle press into his back again and began slithering up the stairs, only stopping when he didn't see Sue following beside him. Turning, he saw her green scales had flattened in fear as she looked between him and the Terran.
I can't go up. It's too painful,
she whispered, and Siver bristled.
What do you mean it's too painful? You moved just fine a few moments ago.
Suv shook her head side to side and kept frantically looking between the Terran and the stairs, before the former picked her up by the waist and lifted her off the ground like a sack of potatoes. Stop lollygagging and let's get off this rock, she growled, Suv immediately silencing herself as Siver glided upwards, only stopping when he couldn't move forward any further. A massive beam had fallen across the last stretch of stairs, blocking their path. They were trapped and were going to starve down here with an undead Terran. The Terran pushed Siver out of the way as she huffed, lowering her rifle. Massive pulses of energy formed before blasting through the front of the weapon, melting the beam into a puddle of molten steel. Keep fucking moving, she growled. Siver moving forward as fast as his belly could take him, pushing Snow out of the way. He did not want to be on the wrong end of that weapon, under any circumstances. He had hatchlings of his own to take care of. Well, future hatchlings. Hopefully. He definitely needed to find someone to lay eggs with, especially after this entire trip. He was done with salvaging for a while, a very, very long while. Hours later, Siver opened the bay doors to the ship he and his hatchmate had ascended to the planet with. It wasn't a very large ship at all, just enough room for his sibling and himself. The human had to bend over, grunting in pain as she set Suv down to the floor. She hadn't said a word the entire time she had been held by the Terran, being completely silent, completely unlike her until now.
Siver, as soon as we get up into space, I want you to open the bay doors and space this monster,
she hissed, moving towards the bridge with immense speed. Siver, however, was wondering something. How did the Terran not have a universal translator, and why? Even if they've been extinct for a long time, well, apparently not, but seemingly so, then they should have had one from their time in the galactic stage. He was still pondering this as the Terran raised her arm and placed the weapon on the wall of the ship, the metal seemingly sloughing off her arm and integrating into the ship wall.
Suv! Suv! She has nanomachines!
He screeched, slithering away as fast as he could. There wasn't really anywhere to go, and he could see the ship gradually shifting around him, Hallways were growing taller, wider, more accommodating to the Terran. She was taking over his hatchmate's ship at a terrifying pace, and as he burst into the bridge, he saw Sue staring at the controls. It was moving, as if its surface were made of sand. Levers changing positions, DNA scanner pads breaking down and being repurposed for something else. They huddled together in the corner of the room as the ship groaned, stretching into a more aerodynamic shape. It almost looked like a bird, wings spread wide and ready for flight. The viewing port had expanded from a small circular porthole into a massive window, showing a raging blizzard moving towards the Terran ship. Pretty neat, huh? They both jumped as the Terran stood in the doorway of the bridge, a new airlock forming above her head while she strode into the room. She patted the side of the ship and bent down, a small nub forming on the console. She broke it off and placed it in her ear. Stretching, she pointed her finger at the two of them and grinned. Much better. Speak. Sivir just shook in fear, but Suv leaned forward and unlocked her helmet, flaring her hood almost as soon as she was free of her restricting helm.
You, Terran, are stealing a Galactic Coalition ship. My ship!
She screamed, fangs showing as she drew herself up to her full height, which barely came up to the Terran's chest. They raised an eyebrow and then frowned before holding up a hand, one finger up. First of all, I just woke up from cryo, to a room full of my dead friends, with no idea who you two are and what the hell happened. Sivir could see Suv getting ready to start screaming again before the Terran lifted another finger, scowling harder. Secondly, the entire facility was destroyed. My home, the place I made friends and lived in for the past 10 years. 10 years. She took a deep breath in, but this time before she could get a word in, Suv cut in with her own rebuttal.
And we are salvagers. You held us at gunpoint and then had the gall to repurpose my ship. So shut your dirty, thieving mouth.
She slithered forward and poked the Terran's chest. It wasn't as intimidating as Sivir thought she meant it to be. More of a light tap and barely phasing the Terran. She simply pushed the claws out of the way with ease. Too bad. Seems like you have no choice but to listen to me now then, because these nanobots won't exactly let you fly my ship out of here. Not to mention I have superior firepower. She looked them both up and down and tapped a few buttons on the console, the engines roaring to life as the world outside became a white blur. She pulled on a U-shaped lever, the ship tilting at a very sharp angle backwards before shooting forward, throwing both Sivir and Suv backwards and into the wall, blacking out. Some time later, Sivir came to, and picked himself off the ground with a groan and winced. Seems he was doing a lot of that lately, and looked around. The bridge was coated in several different lights, all streaming through the new bridge window. He couldn't see Suv, but the Terran was staring out the window with her hands linked behind her back, completely silent. He thought about ambushing her, but he was almost certain she would thwart him. He wasn't even sure if his venom would work on a Terran, so he simply didn't try. He made a soft hiss and waited for her to turn, but she never did. Been looking through your data files. There's a lot there I don't think even your sister knew about. There was an entire book on galactic history, and yet not a single mention of humans anywhere in it. Which is very strange since we started this entire space age. Now she turned, eyes enraged as she punched the console and growled. Sivir half expected it to fold in half. So tell me, what happened to my species? That last sentence was so cold and menacing, Sivir thought she was going to kill him right there.
Well, I was taught that Terrans had destroyed themselves, spreading themselves too thin among the stars.
The Terran threw something at Siv. It flew too fast for him to see, and an iron bar embedded itself into the ship wall, quivering and warbling slowly as the rest of his energy dispersed. He flattened himself in submission, shaking as he covered his head.
The section on Terrans was very short in my education,
he shakily said, keeping his eyes down as he shook. The Terran let out a breath and walked over, helping him back onto his belly and brushing off anything that happened to stick to his suit. He still hadn't taken it off, and it was getting uncomfortable. Sorry, didn't mean to rage out on you. Probably isn't helping the situation. Your sister was just extremely aggressive, and I thought you might be lying. She laughed and rolled up her sleeve, showing 2 puncture wounds at nearly equal distances. They had been sealed, a crusty brown substance covering them, but they were clearly a bite wound. Sivert was very glad he hadn't tried to ambush her. Clearly, the venom hadn't done anything to her. So, yeah, sorry. But I don't think you are. I think you're much more reasonable than your sister. Sivert tilted his head, making sure to keep his hood flat against his scalp as he looked the human up and down. She was wearing a thin white t-shirt, the sleeves cut off just below the shoulder, black pants with a lot of pockets, and a black coating over her left arm. He assumed that was the nanomachines.
You did steal her ship,
Was the first thing that passed his lips, his claws trying to close his own mouth before they left. But it was too late. The human raising an eyebrow before letting out a barking laugh, very different from his own people. I did. I wasn't going to keep it, but she seemed like such a bitch I had to mess with her. She nodded to herself and patted Siv on the back, nearly knocking him over as she drew herself to her full height, towering over him yet again as she smiled down at him. But I really need this ship. Sorry, I can't give it back just yet. I need to find out what happened to us. Sivert spent the next few weeks getting to know the human. Not that he had much of a choice. He was stuck on the ship unless he wanted to leave out the airlock, which was a terrible idea. Turns out his hatchmate had been thrown in the belly of the ship, the brig, as the human called it. He wasn't sure why, but she wouldn't elaborate. Eventually, he did learn her name. Everything had gone by so fast at the salvage site that he hadn't paid attention to what the robot had announced when she emerged from her cryopod, and even got his hatchmate released, though Eve had not liked that one bit.
So, Eve, where are we going? You never told me where we were headed,
he asked her, looking out the bridge window and watching as the stars passed by. Red dwarves, white giants, all manner of different stars. Eve sighed and tapped her foot against the ground, something that Siv had come to find absolutely fascinating. Well, Earth. I really need to make sure home is at least still there, she answered, her voice cracking a little. She had been thinking about this a lot, it seemed. It made sense. He had told her her people were extinct almost immediately, or at least gone. Sivert patted her leg as Suv hissed in disapproval, rolling her eyes.
You've gotten mighty friendly with our kidnapper, hatchmate,
she spat out, making Sivert turn and flare his hood at her. Raising himself to his full height and slithering forward, he pushed his chest against hers in challenge. He pushed her into the next room as she slowly slid backwards, her eyes wide with surprise.
Well, you kidnapped me, you know, right from my home. Not only that, but why wouldn't I? She hasn't tried to kill us. We're stuck on this ship with her and, hatchmate, may I remind you that you got us in this predicament by touching things you shouldn't have touched.
He slowly raised his voice as he spoke until he was nearly yelling. He hadn't realized he had that much anger in himself at his sibling, but he did. Her eyes showed hurt, but her actions showed she wasn't hurt because of the content of what he said, but because he had directed his anger towards her.
How dare you, Siver! I am the older Solarian. I am the older hatchmate. I have the rights!
Eve stepped into the room and simply grabbed Suv by her hood and tossed her down a forming hole in the deck and heard her angry hissing disappear into the distance. towards the brig. Damn, she's a bitch, Eve said, and shook her head, headed back towards the console before bolting to it, an alarm going off. It screamed at the two of them as Sivert quickly followed, making it into the bridge with a huff. The view ahead had changed, a red planet splattered in green slowly growing larger, before there was a shimmer, a massive ship materializing before them, a cloak powered down, back to front. It was angular, turrets and cannons covering its surface as they slowly turned towards their tiny ship. And it was tiny, barely a speck beside it. Sivert guessed it was probably the size of a very large moon, if not a dwarf planet. A message barked out from a speaker beneath Eve's hand.
Foreign vessel, turn back. This is a quarantine zone, as stated by the Galactic Coalition. Quarantine indefinite. No entry permitted.
Eve listened before a predatory grin spread over her face. Quarantine? What quarantine? She grabbed the steering column and thrust it forward, engines bursting to life and throwing the ship off balance. Turrets fired, barely grazing the ship as Eve dove past the offending ship, dodging hail after hail of bullets and plasma fire. Sivert was screaming in fear at every shot, thinking they were all dead as Eve deftly kept them alive just a few moments longer. This cat and mouse continued until they entered a belt of asteroids, the ship coming to a stop slowly as they began dodging hunks of rock instead of armaments. And then they were through. Before them, a brilliant green and blue marble slowly floating in space, ships coming and going from the surface to the extremely large moon orbiting the planet. Their communications relay was being blown up by hundreds of messages hitting them all at once, all seemingly automated. Harsh, electronically modulated words flowed into their ears. Eve sighed and leaned back against the console, eyes watering. I'm home,